I'm looking forward to this lecture. I've worn a special shirt that Andrew gave me but doesn't even remember. It says Blum Mania. And I thought he had it made to order, but at the time he gave it to me, he said he found it in a 99-cent store. And tonight he says he doesn't remember it at all. So he gets away scot-free on this. But I'm going to go back one if I can figure out how. So far not. Yes. No? Nope. Let's go back. Okay. Here we are in 1993. Andrew has not changed at all, except he doesn't remember this shirt. And we were just celebrating the publication of the Blum book. We had both been very interested in certain buildings in the city, and we said, I got to show you these buildings. And I said, that's weird, I have to show you these buildings. And we didn't know that we had the same list of buildings. So we sat down together and we had 30 or so buildings that we had both found individually, and we said, oh, let's figure out what these guys are up to. We thought they were from Vienna probably, or maybe Germany. And we really just started from scratch and began to do research and work on what we could about these architects. And so it was quite an adventure. And during all of these years, we've continued looking at their buildings. Sometimes we've tried to intervene to protect them. We've watched certain of them be torn apart piece by piece. And it's continued as an interest. I won't say obsession, but we really have cared about their work a great deal. So with that introduction, I wanted to spend a moment giving you a little background. Dramatic transformations occurred in New York's residential neighborhoods during the first decades of the 20th century, when thousands of apartment houses were being constructed. As increasing numbers of affluent New Yorkers moved out of single-family houses into apartments, a number of architects gained prominence by specializing in the design of this type of building. Some of the finest apartment buildings were provided by the little-known firm of George and Edward Blum, and the Blums succeeded in combining the typical rectilinear massing of a New York apartment house with novel uses of materials that were seemingly influenced by contemporary progressive trends in French architecture. Their buildings are striking for the complexity of the brick patterning, for the expressive terracotta detail, and the innovative use of art tile. From 1909 to 1929, they built over 120 apartment houses, numerous loft buildings, and a variety of other structures. We won't look at all of them, I promise. Okay, so with that in mind, let's see. Oh, we're going to be back to the old next.
What is the circle?
The circle?
The one on the right.
One on the right. Okay, good. Thank you for your help. There's not a lot known about the Blum family. I found out things like where their mother's wedding ring is, and was able to tell the person who had it what the initials stood for inside it, and where the ashes of George went, and things like that, which I didn't even put in footnotes, but we really dug around, and it was hard to learn much. We did find out that the family moved from France and settled in New York in 1868. George was born in 1870, and 6 years later the family moved back to Paris, and shortly thereafter Edward was born. And both of them spent their youth in France, and the family eventually did move back to New York City, but that was in 1888 when George was 18 and Edward was 12. By 1899, Edward had received his Bachelor of Science degree No, his Bachelor of Science in Architecture degree, from Columbia. And then he went on to Beaux-Arts, École des Beaux-Arts in 1901. He remained in France till about 1905. And we have Edward here in the bow tie, and then here as a more mature adult, but we have no pictures at all so far of George. So we have to imagine what he'd look like. We do know that George went to the École in 1904, and he did not return to New York until about 1908. And during the time that he was in Europe, he did a great deal of sketching of monuments and various fountains and buildings throughout Europe. We found, with a little help, a cache of his drawings and Edward's drawings in a flea market when we were working on the Blum book, and the guy was so excited that someone cared, and he was selling them for $10 a piece, and I just said, I'll take the whole thing, you know. And so he felt like he really struck gold, and we did too, because we got a chance to see the difference in the way that they drew, wrote, their signatures, and in some cases Edward's work was coming from his study at Columbia, and eventually I will try to donate some of that work to the Columbiana room because it shows what a student at Columbia was doing in 1897 and 8 and so on. So it was that was kind of exciting, and he certainly was a draftsman. Okay. The special character of the Blums' apartment houses is evident in their earliest building, the Phaeton. The street facade has the most Parisian features of any building designed by the Blums, and it's the only New York apartment house of the era that used exterior mosaic panels. And it's very hard to see here, I know that, and these pictures are hard to read, but this is the Phaeton. And I will show you some details of the panels that are inset into here. But I wanted to point out the diaper brick patterning, which was something that was used a great deal in France, and also other Parisian inspiration, which you can't see in this. There were fleur-de-lis on the metal balconies, and there were also these loges, which actually were tiled and sloped roofs. You can see where it was stripped off. This is the same part of the building as this. And now, and for many, many years, the loges have been removed. The facade of the Phaeton, above the traditional flat limestone, is clad in a brick, which is, as I said, the diaper pattern. And I think that we don't see hardly any of this in later buildings. What we see is another kind of texture that I'll try to point out that uses more than just the brick, although we don't see more mosaic in the future, at least outside. So here you get a chance to see the circular mosaic and some details of the way the odd-shaped bricks were cut and used, and more of this coming down. So this would continue right up here. You'd have the circle, but we just have two details. Nope. Okay, the next building I wanted to show you, and we have somebody who actually lives in this building, who's in our audience, is the Rockfall. And you can see that this also had a loggia at the corner. This is long gone, and the building has been stripped in a number of reiterations. It's disheartening. But what's interesting is that this type of tiled loggia was used in Paris. This is an example by Henri Sauvage. And at a similar time, this is a little earlier, 1907, but this is one, and of course the metal balconies, which you would have seen in the Phaeton if the image was a little stronger. So those were things that were some of the influences from Paris, but there are others which are more striking. Here you see a school by Louis Bonnard, and it's a very beautiful combination of brick. Many buildings in Paris have a brick structure that's complicated, has decorative patterns, and exploits brick as a form and material. In addition, a lot of the facades include wonderful terracotta, tile, and mosaic, and they create really dynamic patterns, rich in color and in texture. And this area here is detailed over here. So you get a sense of not only the brick and the step back, but these glass triangles and all of this colored glass mosaic, which you have to imagine because I have it in color right now. It's instructive, I think, to try to compare the first two buildings. You looked at the Phaeton and at the Rockfall with the other early apartment houses at the time. And we're looking at the Doralton and the McKim Mead and White building on Fifth Avenue. The large apartment houses that were being built around 1900 were primarily Beaux-Arts style, a very bold architectural and sculptural detail. But by 1910, a more subdued Italian Renaissance style was adapted. And you can see that in the difference between these two buildings and the 10-year period. Between 1910 and 1917, George and Edward Blum designed 17 buildings with facades notable for geometric patterns suggestive of woven textiles. Now, this isn't being said because it's the Urban Fabric Show. It's really something that it felt, that's what it felt like to us as we studied it, the buildings. The key element is the accumulation of small-scale features into a unified wall surface. These elements are composed of standard size or oddly shaped, as you saw with the mosaics, bricks in several earth tones, and also blue or sometimes green decorative tiles. The arrangement and integration of the elements as they alternate across the facade result in richly interwoven compositions. And this is an interesting Blum building on 108th Street, and a detail where you can see groovy tiles that are glazed, and also a chance to see some of the texture of the brick, another tile down here. And it's interesting to compare it with the corner building, which is the Manchester. That was built in 1909 by Neville and Bagg, and it has a rusticated limestone base. This is a flat limestone base. And then it has a lot of projecting ornament and cornice, which is very much tacked onto the building, very three-dimensional. This surface is very, very two-dimensional, but textured, as you can see from this kind of surface. So that kind of contrast is something that begins to become really clear. And in 1914, they completed the Vauxhall, which is a really interesting building on Riverside Drive. And from just the drawing, you start to see this kind of patterning that's happening, and all along the cornice. And we'll look at that in a photograph. And it's really hard with this light, but in through here and up through here is kind of a textured pattern, and you'll see in the detail that this is what the pattern is made up of. Many small pieces of tile that's glazed in several colors, and brick in several colors of different shapes. So when we talk about a surface that's interwoven, it's this kind of detail, and sometimes interesting metalwork. This is not especially standout metalwork, but we'll show you other examples later. It was this kind of surface that was one of the things to catch our attention. The fact that somebody was interested in the material brick, and using it in special ways, and introducing tile, which no one else was doing at all. George and Edward Blum's exploration of terracotta demonstrates the same sensitivity and inventiveness as the firm's handling of brick and tile. Almost every building that they constructed used terracotta ornament. Not every, but almost. Unlike other apartment house architects in New York, the Blums did not use stock items. They didn't order from a catalog. They had a very definite aesthetic, and they commissioned work to be done from their own drawings. Between 1910 and 1913, they designed over a dozen apartment houses with facades faced with beige or white glazed brick and matching terracotta. And here you see the Adamston, which is on 89th, and I would like to show you one or two details of the ornament that's happening up here. This is an example of a drawing from the cornice, and you get the sense of a swoosh through here, and it's hard to see, but there are leaves. And this is a bad picture, but at least gives you the sense of how it's translated into the terracotta on that building. And a better image of a slightly different area is shown here. So you have representational images. You have kind of abstracted branches maybe, and then you have really defined geometry, repetition of straight lines or bands, little squares. So throughout the next few buildings that you see, it's this interesting combination of geometric and organic that they managed to carry out. And I think that this is another thing that really caught our attention, particularly in this next building. This is the Dahlier, and it's maybe our favorite building. I don't know if Andrew would say, but it's one I've watched for years, and sadly it's been stripped and stripped and stripped, and now the doors were just ripped off, and the metalwork is very special on these doors. And there's another Blum addict who saved them and moved them to another Blum building. So we're very grateful that they're not completely gone. But it's so disheartening to watch this. It's only 2 blocks from me, so I have to go by it a lot. It's really quite a remarkable building. I'm going to show you details that are down here. But throughout this section and the cornice, this is all taken off now. Anyway, this is intact, and it's really very, very interesting. It gives you an insight into the way that they were looking at ornament and the realization of how they could use it. This is just 2 panels from the area I showed you, and it's nice to compare this with Alexandre Bigot's ceramics in Paris from a very, well, this is actually a little earlier, about 5 years earlier. But the texture, you know, we said, where are they getting these ideas? And we couldn't really answer that until we understood a little bit about their background and discovered that they were French, that they had spent time in France, they had gone to the École. And then we began to look, great excuse to go to Paris, look and see what we could find in Paris that they might have looked at this time. And there's over 130 interesting buildings that they could have looked at and are still in existence. And that's another book, but that came a little bit later. So if we look at a little more detail on the Dahlier, you'll see as we get close, just one corner of this panel shows you the similarity of this leaf from the Dahlier and these figs, and this leaf from a catalog from Grébert, which is based in Beauvais. So there's interesting parallels. Another aspect of the building, and this is a similar section of the building down low that I was showing you. So you've already seen these in detail, close up. I wanted to point out that there's this motif, which is the X. Behind it up here comes this straight line interrupted with a diamond and down. And behind that are the leaves. The exact reverse happens in this lower level. The very first layer is the leaf. The second layer is the line with the diamond. And way in the back is the crisscross. So what they've actually done is taken the same elements and layered them differently. And it gave them a chance to explore how they wanted to investigate and succeed at using very relatively flat relief to create interesting surfaces. Rather than very sculptural, they actually sort of dug into the building instead of coming way out with a gargoyle, for instance. Another example from another building that's related, and it's great to see this kind of circle of leaves, very flat geometries here. When you think about a balcony, this is a pretty flat balcony for something that's this decorated. And their designs for terracotta, as I had said, are relatively flat, the result of shapes being carved out of the surface of the clay rather than modeled in three-dimensional manner typical of Beaux-Arts ornament. Many of the patterns were created by overlapping geometric elements in layers of low relief. And I think that that was another kind of key that I haven't actually seen anywhere else. I think that's something that they developed as they explored the possibilities of ornament. I haven't seen it in Paris. It's usually one layer or sculptural. This is another example. This is a beautiful white glazed building with really nice terracotta ornament throughout. And it's not just typical ornament which might be at the cornice, under the windows, at a belt course. They really integrated it into the surface of the building. And you can see that with these panels and large set pieces of terracotta with the glazed white brick and very beautiful balcony. This is our same kind of twist in a very abstracted way. Here's the geometry coming in. Really nice repeats of geometry up around the windows. And another example from the same building. These two areas. So here you have the geometry again. And then one thing I noticed in doing this is that this is just one piece. It's the same motif, and this is two pieces. So what that means is that they weren't trying to use the same thing over again for economic reasons. They didn't say, just make this piece in terracotta and we'll just stick it in here and here and here. They actually decided that they wanted this one to have a border and it to be one piece, and this was too large and should be made in two pieces and was set back and didn't need a border. So you get a chance to see a little bit of their thinking when you realize that they're not just using the material for the economy. With the resumption of construction after World War I, George and Edward Blum continued working in the field of apartment house design. Although their buildings from 1920s on are less strikingly original, they still stand apart from their contemporaries, and between 1921 and 30, 26 of their apartment house designs were built in Manhattan. Here is an interesting example where you're getting a certain amount of texture just through the brick being raised a little bit, but more than that, there's an eccentric roof line, which is something that they continue to do throughout the 20s. And in varied ways, a lot of the buildings have sort of a scallop. This building has a triangle that's lopped off flat at the top. So they're exploring the kinds of options that would be allowed in an eccentric kind of roof line. This is another building. It happens to be right next door to the white building on 780, and I look out at both of them from my windows. This is very special. Since I don't live in a Blum building, I get to look at two. But here there's scalloping, which continues right onto the roof line. You notice the geometry comes in again. This is later, and it's a much more Deco ornament. It's just stopping being as organic as the early buildings. Another interesting building on 57th Street with, again, an unusual roof line, and here are a series of triangles. Also note there are Dutch girls that create the balcony, cut out metal figures that they began to introduce in some of their buildings in this period. And another example of that are these children watering plants on the Park Avenue building. Again, a very unusual roof line. No traditional cornices for these guys. And I have to just end, even though it's a little bit beyond the era we were going to cover, there's several remarkable Deco apartment houses that they built, very colorful, and this is one, and this is the upper story. So you see terracotta and brick combined to create this, just colored brick here, very nice detailing around the windows, fantastic ornament on the top, and you can see it from a distance. And then this is down at street level. And just notice this piece is this piece flipped around. This space is this space, but it's inset. This is this space, and same thing here and here. So there's this flip-flop that they introduced, and it's very much in keeping with relief and setback that was carried through their earlier work. And I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now.
Don't take Susan's off yet. I want to go back just to one image. Go to about the middle of Susan's presentation. Yeah, go to this one. This one thing that Susan did mention that we noticed when we were doing. Oh yeah, I have to put this on. When we were doing this was one thing that they did in their ornament, which we'll come back in a minute, which is why is that the organic foliage grows out of the frame. This is something that we noticed also in Paris. It's something that they picked up from Paris, and you can see how the leaves are overlapping the frame over here, and actually on the dahlia. In the reverse, the figs are actually breaking out of the frame as well, and we're going to see that again. Okay, you can go to mine. When I started working on the garment district, I started reliving my life because we had done this big project on the Blum's apartment buildings, and suddenly I'm working on the Blum's commercial buildings. So I'm working on the other side. So I'm going to talk about the commercial buildings. I'm going to go sort of chronologically and sort of plug into some of the things that Susan said to talk about their commercial work. So I do the right side.
Yeah, good luck.
Of the.
You point it really hard at the projector.
Oh, there we go.
Too hard.
I went past the first one, yeah. Okay. Oops. All right. So the Blums begin working in 1909. Where they get their first commissions. The Phaeton was their first apartment house commission. There is one commercial commission from 1909. And then in 1910, they begin to get a whole series of commissions. And this is on West 25th Street. This is one of their earliest commercial buildings. It was built in the Ladies' Mile area, which was where the garment district was located. Was just above and below 23rd Street. Was the center of the garment district before the post-World War II development of the 7th Avenue Garment District. And this was built for Abraham Lefcourt. And there's a whole case about Abraham Lefcourt, and my essay in Chosen Capital is about Abraham Lefcourt as a garment developer. Lefcourt typifies the developers in the garment district in that poor Jewish immigrant grows up on the Lower East Side, becomes a successful garment manufacturer, then starts investing in real estate, and eventually leaves his garment business behind and becomes a major real estate developer. In fact, he became the major real estate developer in the garment district, and for much of his career, until about 1925, he was very loyal to George and Edward Blum and commissioned all his buildings from them, and then for reasons unknown he drops them. So this was his first commission from them, and he built this, and he moved his factory in here, and it occupied part of the space, and the rest was rental space. And you can see, even here at this early period, some of the ideas that Susan was mentioning are evident. You can see the sense of texture in the use of the brick, in the spandrels, in the cornice and the brackets, and something that the Blums really liked to do in their early commercial buildings was there are always two entrances in these commercial buildings. There's the pedestrian entrance and the freight entrance, and at each one there'd be a frame around it and then this cartouche sticking up with the address on it. And you can see this here at the very beginning, and we'll see it at a few other buildings that they designed. So this really marks the beginning of the Blums' commercial work and the beginning of their association, which was going to be very, very important to them, with Abraham Lefcourt. This is another early building on 37th Street, and you can see the same entrance idea over here. In this case, as was true of some of their apartment buildings in the early years, the ones that we didn't really look at very carefully, that they used very traditional ornament in a small number. They designed a few Beaux-Arts buildings. In fact, we were really surprised to find that these had been designed by the Blums. There's one on the south side of 72nd Street between Columbus and Amsterdam that just looks like anybody else's apartment house. And you can see the use of cartouches and lions and other Beaux-Arts details, but still using this form over here. And this is one of the rare times when one of their apartment house developers also commissioned them to do a commercial building. One of the things that I've learned recently, as I've been thinking about this, is that many of the same architects who designed the garment factories, and George and Edward Blum designed 19 buildings, I think it's 19 buildings, in the 7th Avenue Garment District, that is between 35th and 40th, between Broadway and 9th Avenue, and they designed about 30 other commercial buildings. Schwartz and Gross were the most prolific architects in the garment district, and also major apartment house designers. And almost all the other architects who worked in the garment district were also apartment house architects. They almost never had the same developers. The developers came from the same background for apartment houses and lofts, but they weren't usually the same people. So this is a rare example of an overlap with that. This was a really hazy day a few weeks ago when I took this, so I'm sorry you can't see a good example. You don't see a good view of this. This is 17 East 17th Street, which is a 1911 building, very, very early, and really unusual in the fact that it doesn't use tile. It uses cast concrete, which is then polychromed. And there is one apartment building, the Adlon, of which we have a resident here who's been involved with the restoration of the polychromy to the cast concrete. And you can see that here. This is a restoration also. And Susan and I didn't look at this building before, so we don't know what the condition was. But after a restoration, you can see the sort of vibrancy of the cast concrete on this building. Very arts and crafts aesthetic here, but again, as Susan was saying, it's not applied, it's flat, and the color is integral to the design of the building. And just some modest projections. Two of their most interesting early commercial buildings that the Blums designed are next door to one another on 41st Street between 5th and Madison Avenues. And they're within the area that the city would like to rezone for super mega towers. So we worry a little bit about these two buildings. One of them is pretty tall. The other one's only about 4 or 5 stories over here. This one is superficially Gothic in its look, but the ornament is similar to many of the things that Susan was talking about. You can see the figs that we saw in the Dahlia appear over there. Actually, there are figs in this one. Oh, and here's another fig. You can see how the leaves are lapping out of the frame over here, and here this whole intertwining vine of those same spiny leaves and figs. So at about, what's the year of the deluge?
12.
12. So, and this is 11. So maybe they used this first here, and then they adapted these ornamental forms for the deluge. So, but you really can see this very, very unusual aesthetic. Neither this nor the deluge is a landmark, although the deluge is in a historic district that's been heard but not designated, although not soon enough. We've been proposing it for 20 years, long before it got pieces removed. And then the ideas that Susan was talking about the overlap of organic and geometric detail is really evident here, where you can see each of these balconies is different. And you don't notice that at first, because superficially they're the same. But then as you look more closely, the cartouche form is a little bit different. But they're in these almost Wiener Werkstatt-y sort of Hofmann-like geometric frames. And you can see the same thing on the shields, and then the organic figs, and then this kind of vine form, which Susan talked about. And this is a lower building next door, which also, of course, has a similar, very intense patterning of organic and organic forms in a geometric framework. That's really quite amazing. In 1914, Lefcourt commissioned the Blums to design another building at 134 West 37th Street. And this building becomes very important in Lefcourt's myth-making. Lefcourt was an amazing PR person, and his biography and his story were widely published in the real estate press and the popular press, and he developed a whole myth of his life. It was very hard, for example, to find out where he was actually born, because he was constantly telling different stories about his birth and upbringing, and everything was very dramatic in his upbringing, and and everything he did was incredibly wonderful and pioneering. And he uses this building to set the myth. So first of all, the design is quite interesting. It typifies the pre-zoning lofts, in that it's about 12 or 14 stories, right up to the lot line, rising straight up, with a modest cornice at the top, very large windows, and in the interior, open floors, concrete, sprinklers, fireproof, everything that a garment factory would want. He actually moves his factory into this building for a while. This is on 37th Street between Broadway and 7th Avenue. Built pretty early in 1914, but it's not the first garment-related building that was beginning to creep towards 7th Avenue during this period. But after the 1919 construction of the Garment Center Capitol, which there's a case about over there, and there's a panel about over here, which is the first major project in the garment district, Lefcourt begins investing in other buildings in the garment industry, and he begins to claim that he was the inventor of the 7th Avenue garment industry, that he, as he said, he had come to believe that sooner or later the entire garment industry in New York would finally be located from 36th to 39th Street, from Broadway to 8th Avenue. So he's created this myth that it was his idea and it was all him, and this was the great pioneering building. And this, of course, is completely absurd, but he uses it as a marketing tool and to get a lot of publicity for himself and, of course, for his buildings. This is, you can see that same kind of ornament. Both of these panels flank the doorways. This panel is this panel. This is stone. This is limestone, and you can see the depth of that very deep kind of ornament that he liked. And what you can see is that there's also the address numbers are over the doors as well here. So he's continuing. The Blums are continuing to use that form. And here you can see it on a contemporary building between 5th and 6th Avenues. Just proof that Lefcourt had not committed himself to the 7th Avenue Garment District, because the next year he's back designing another loft building between 5th and 6th Avenues. And he also was a member of the organization that was trying to save the ladies' mile garment industry and keep the the garment industry there and not move to 7th Avenue, who is a founder of that organization as well. These shouldn't be gilded, but the landlord's been a little overzealous there. This is, I think, one of the really interesting early Blum commercial buildings. This is on the corner of 5th Avenue and 31st Street. And everything that Susan was talking about gets summed up in this really interesting building that's passed by thousands of people every day, and practically nobody notices it. But if you look carefully at this building, it's really quite spectacular. This is on the upper floor, and you can see the zigzags and the very flat geometric ornament and the patterns of terracotta and brick on the facade. And then the sort of wave patterns. Here's from the door. They've turned it sideways here. But then this is an owl. And that up there in the center there and over here, I think that one seems to be a sort of curled up bird. I don't know, or maybe a baby dinosaur or something. And this one, I go back and forth between bird and bat here. But you can see all the curvy, swirly form. So it's, again, this sense of texture and the use of organic and geometric features. But what was the reason that I came to be looking at the Blums again is because they were so active within the 7th Avenue Garment District. The development begins in 1919 with the Garment Center Capital, and by 1920 other developers, including Lefcourt, but many others, are beginning to build buildings. And between 1919 and 1930, the entire area between 35th and 40th and Broadway and 9th Avenue is almost completely redeveloped from a largely immigrant and African American slum area with tenements and altered row houses to the center, the American Center for the Manufacture of Ladies' Garments. And this is a typical building in the Garment District, one of the Blum's largest commissions. This is the Gilbert Building. It was commissioned by 3 garment manufacturers who moved their factories in here. So one of the interesting things about this district is that the Blums worked with the garment manufacturers, some of whom stayed as manufacturers and many others of whom became developers like Lefcourt. Left the garment industry and became developers. The Blums, there are a number of things that are interesting about what the Blums did. Although the garment factories, there's not a lot of money usually spent on ornament on these buildings. They're utilitarian buildings. They're speculative buildings in which every inch was rental space in the buildings. But they did a number of interesting things that were different from the way the other architects who were working in the district did things. First of all, although I hesitate to give style names to these buildings because in a sense their form, what's interesting about them comes from the setbacks of the zoning. Most of the architects plastered a little bit of classical ornament, maybe a cartouche here and there on their buildings, but the Blums liked using little bits of Gothic ornament on their buildings, and their pointed arches over here. There's a very strong verticality to the buildings. They really liked what Carol was mentioning to me this weekend, the use of these brick shadow lines on the side facades. They used that on a number of their buildings where the facade was going to be visible. Because in this case, it overlooks what was St. Chrysostom's Episcopal Church. This is now gone, so you don't see the shadow lines on this building anymore. They did work extensively with Lefcourt on several major buildings. Lefcourt designed 4 major buildings on Broadway for showrooms. And the Blums designed the 2 earliest of them. And this is one of the largest, the Lefcourt Marlborough building. Lefcourt moved his offices into this building. You can see why Lefcourt signed his name in all his buildings. He was one critic who didn't really think much of Lefcourt, called him the Little Napoleon, because he put his name on all the buildings. And you can still see that. And his presence is still here in New York if you look for it. There are about a dozen buildings that still have his name carved into them. So the Blums were actively working with Lefcourt. The Blums also, this was evident in the Gilbert building, but you can see it here in these two buildings, that the Blums did something really interesting with the zoning. Different architects use the requirements for setbacks in different ways, and one thing that the Blums did was they massed their buildings in an asymmetrical manner, so that there's a tower rising up on the right side of both this building and that building over there. So it gives them more of a dramatic feel as the setbacks are cascading up. They have 3-story bases. They're massed in a very vertical manner going up, accentuating the height. And then not only is there the tower, but it's angled also, creating these very dramatic rise to these buildings. Oops, did I go too far? No. Oh. And it was not only on the mid-block buildings that they did this, like the Gilbert building and the two that we just saw, but on the corners as well, where the Blums designed several absolutely humongous factory buildings. I mean, just imagine how many factory workers could be in a building like this. Thousands and thousands of workers would be here. And you can see, again, how it cascades up in an asymmetrical manner to create the corner tower. And then there are some little Gothic-y pinnacles up at the top of the building. Interestingly, they never use Gothic inspired ornament on their apartment buildings. And here you can contrast this. This is a garment loft by Schwartz and Gross, typical of Schwartz and Gross's buildings. And they were the most active architects in the district. The Blums were the second most active. And you can see that they use the setbacks in a completely symmetrical manner. On this building, that it rises up in the center and it sets back, and then it's symmetrical to either side. So there's and this was the way most of the other architects massed their buildings. So there's an interesting, that although the zoning law was very prescribed, different architects could follow the rules in different ways, and I think the Blums did it in a particularly interesting and innovative manner. And here you just get a sense of some of the modest Gothic detail. This is at the top of one of their buildings, and these are in the 3-story commercial bases. These are out of cast iron. And the issue of texture, even during this period when the buildings don't have the intertwining vines and the figs anymore, the sense of texture that the Blums loved continues to be evident in their use of materials. And you can see it in brick here, where the bricks are pulled in and out, sort of like Susan showed in that one apartment house where some of the bricks were pulled out. So here every other brick is pushed in. And then you have these terracotta panels, and then these brick buttresses projecting out in front. Here these panels are flat, but they're using 2 different colors of brick to give the illusion of depth. And up there are panels pushed in, and then there's the bricks in the zigzags. And this is almost identical to that apartment house on Park Avenue, on West End Avenue.
What year is it?
This is 25.
And that was 25.
Yeah, I mean, astonishing how they're using some of the same terracotta ornament. And I actually had forgotten about that building until the image went up. And you can actually see the windowsill up near the top here also has organic ornament, and it's got petals. It's got flowers, and then there's a band that goes above, that winds above and below it, so it appears like they're flipping back and forth just by using that very simple band there. So they're still playing with complex forms here, but in a lot less expensive manner. Whoops. And I just wanted to, they worked not only in the garment center, the ladies' garment center, the 7th Avenue Garment District, but in what people in the 1920s referred to as the suburbs of the garment district. They worked in the millinery district, which was between 5th and 6th Avenues. They designed several major buildings, and they worked extensively in the fur district as well. And I just wanted to show you one very special building in the fur district, one of their largest mid-block buildings, 150 West 30th Street, which you can see not only has the shadow lines, but in dark brick they've put in the address of the building. And here you can see the mass of the building, and it's typical in its asymmetrical massing. There's a tower on the right side of the building. As it cascades up, it has a 3 or 4 story base, as was typical. One of the interesting things, of course, that we've seen Oh, and here, well, you can't see it very well because of the light, but this was with the cascades of setbacks, is that none of the ornament said anything about ladies' garments. It's mostly generic ornament. And this is an incredibly rare building. It's a building that says something about its use. And this is in the Fur District. And I'm not sure what these are, but it looks like there are dozens of wolverines or something looking out at you. And I'd walked by this building a number of times, and it was only with my telephoto lens that I realized that what was projecting out. I just thought they were, regular projections. But I don't know if wolverine was a favorite fur of the 1920s, but I have to get a zoologist to tell me exactly what these are.
Beavers.
But they don't look like beavers. They don't look like beavers. And they don't look like foxes either. Badgers. It could be badgers. So I think that what this has what the lesson is that maybe we should have done all the Blums all at once, because the commercial buildings are really parallel and are in their own way are really interesting, and I think vernacular building types in general are ignored, and apartment houses only recently have people become interested in apartment houses as a interesting building type, and we've tried to get the Dalieu and the Vauxhall and a couple of others designated as landmarks with no success. But if apartment houses were ignored, then garment lofts are completely ignored. And I don't think anybody's thought at all about this what makes some of these commercial buildings really special. And I think that it's time that we did. So thank you. So I'm sure Susan and I would be happy to answer any questions people have.
A little bit more. I have a question about the apartment buildings. What about the plans? Was there anything distinctive about the floor plans and the arrangement of the apartments?
Really not. The lobbies were pretty terrific. There was some really interesting treatment of lobby walls. The Phaeton had a beautiful mural, a plaster mural and mosaics. The metal work in the lobbies, the ceilings, the floors were tile, very often Gruby tile, which is very special. The lighting fixtures are special. But in general, the floor plans and the layouts were pretty standard.
Yeah, they're pretty standard.
Yeah.
You did speculative work, and the developer maybe spend a few extra dollars on the Terra-Cotta, but he was going to do the plans that we're going to sell. Going to rent. No, because by this time you're getting those more integrated apartments without the long halls, except in some of the more modest buildings, like the Phaeton has long halls. And a few of the early buildings do. But the Admiston and the Edmiston, those were very classy buildings. The Edmiston, which is the companion to the Admiston, which Susan didn't show, it has fantastic duplex apartments in it. So they were going for an upper middle class market. What's really interesting, and some of the lobbies have the same kind of ornament, but in plaster. And in fact, the left court building on the commercial building on 36th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues that I showed, it also has that same kind of plaster ornament on the lobby, which I was photographing until they told me I couldn't. But I did get a couple of good photographs of it. But the really interesting is the more modest Blum apartment houses have lobbies of brick with Gruby tile.
Yeah, all brick walls.
Yeah, the less
amazing.
Expensive ones. Actually, there's one on 181st Street that has that, and they're just spectacular.
Where was the Terra-Cotta made?
A lot of companies were involved. We tried in our book to list anything that we actually were able to document. The New York Architectural Terra Cotta Company in Long Island City produced probably more than any other company, but the other companies were involved. Perth Amboy, South Amboy, all of it was really close. There were so many companies between New York and New Jersey that they based the record. The records show that the shipping costs could make or break a deal. in the bidding. It's interesting. Andrew, do you think that the apartment houses have had more attention because many of them became co-ops and the owners had a vested interest in the buildings as opposed to the garment district where they were rented by one owner?
I think that people have, especially in the co-op, people pay more attention to where they're living and want it to look beautiful. And in the garment industry, especially those that have remained manufacturing, usually are. There's usually a sense of benign neglect, and which is both good and bad. I mean, it's bad because they deteriorate, but it's good because things don't get removed. And those that have become more expensive in their leasing and their tenants have survived a little bit less well in the detail, especially the lobbies. The lobbies have gotten ripped out.
Marble, big sheets of marble are thrown in, and the floors are pulled up.
But in the other case, then sometimes some of those facades have been cleaned and restored. So if you're going to go for an expensive class of tenant, then you're going to spend a little bit more money in making the building look. You're going to appreciate the building a little more.
Question about the Gothic commercial buildings, because they didn't do that in their residential buildings.
No.
Were those for one particular developer, and could that have been the developers, so that wasn't...
It was for many different developers. They besides Left Court, they worked for many different people. Sometimes they worked for the same person twice, but none of the others were major developers. Mostly they're relatively small scale developers, or at least small scale within the district. So they must, for some reason, have thought that this was an appropriate aesthetic. Even if it's relatively modest, they started putting on pointed arched entrances, for example. It does set their buildings apart from others, and I don't know if that was a reason that they wanted to do it, but they're doing it for a lot of different developers.
But it's especially interesting to see the building on 41st Street because in a way it's very three-dimensional. It's sort of mini Woolworth in one sense, and yet when you look at the details the way Andrew was presenting them, it's so personal, it's so unusual, and so un-Gothic.
Yeah, go next time if you're around in Midtown and you're at the New York Public Library, just go take a look at them. They're really stunning. I stood in front of them for about an hour looking at them a couple of weeks ago, and the light was really beautiful.
And there's a third building on that block, so it really makes it worth looking at. It was the American Encaustic Tiling Company building. It was partly destroyed by the owner.
But yeah, it has a lot of the original tile.
But it does have some of the original tile left. He was going to smash it all with a hammer. He did a lot in front of us just to show us that he wasn't going to let it be landmarked. It's pathetic. But some of it's remained.
So, Andrew, have you compared their commercial buildings to the commercial buildings in France, and were they following a less running style?
No, I don't think so, because I don't think there's anything comparable in the high-rise nature of the commercial architecture in France at the time. And I, with the exception of the modest Gothic detail, I think you can say that most of the forms used on the commercial buildings also appear on the apartment houses. And in the early period, in the pre-World War I period, I would say that the ornament is very much inspired by French design in the same way that Susan was talking about the apartment houses. I don't think that their post-war architecture, in either residential or commercial, is as Parisian-based. I think the one thing they picked up on, though, and that they continued, was they clearly had a love of texture. And that they learned that early, the way they handled materials. And so I don't think I can make a parallel on the post-war stuff.
You might even argue that Paris in the 20s, in the later 20s, that the architects were following the New York
What was done in New York,
as an
absolutely.
image of modernity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah.
Jane.
Did you come across evidence of extending that, evidence of them traveling back and forth to Paris during the time?
Yes, I think that there are ship records.
Yeah.
I think on the ship manifests they did go a few times. And they were French. They spoke French. They'd been to the École des Beaux-Arts. They were from Alsace originally. They probably had family. in France. So they do go, but I don't see a later evidence, nor indeed is the architecture from the 20s creative in the way that they weren't interested in modernism. So the creative architecture of their later years, they probably wouldn't have been interested in.
Yes.
Could you expand a little bit more on the overlap of developers? Or you said there was an overlap of architects who did residential and commercial in the Garment District. But developers, that was a distinct...
Very rarely. I found, the other day I was, sometimes you forget when you write that you've done some research and that you found. So the other day I was going through this survey I did of West End Avenue that I didn't do that long ago, and I'd completely forgotten that there was one apartment house on West End Avenue by Abraham Bricken. And Bricken was a major garment center developer. One of the cases is the Bricken Textile Building, and there's the Bricken Arcade Building, and all kinds of Bricken stuff. So he did one building. One of the Tishmans did some garment buildings and did one or two apartment houses on the west side. So there's a little bit of overlap, but not very much. Left Court did an apartment hotel on Central Park South, but that's his only, I can't remember which one, but one of the big apartment hotels, the Navarre, I think. But that's the only residential building that he did. And the only person for whom there's an exception is there are two buildings in the Garment District called the Champagne Buildings. And they were designed by the architectural, and they were built by and designed by Champagne and Champagne, who were architects of just basic 6-story speculative apartment buildings all over Brooklyn. But most of the developers are a completely different set, and it's especially true in the Garment District, where many of the developers were also garment manufacturers.
Did you have a question?
I was going to ask, were the Blums Jewish? Did they have that connection with Abraham Blum?
They were.
Yeah. I don't even know how we know that.
We found that out from
something.
somewhere, but yes,
Yeah.
they were.
We're making it up, right?
And that was one of the things that I talk about in the exhibit was the interconnection between the Jewish developers and the Jewish architects and the Jewish garment factory owners and the Jewish workers, and that there's this whole overlap of ethnicity in the development here. They were exceptional in that most of the developers were Eastern Europeans, and the Blums were from France, and Eli Jacques Kahn, another one of the major architects, he was from Austria, and whereas Schwartz and Gross and some of the other architects were from Eastern Europe, or at least of Eastern European parentage.
Yes, Michael.
Have you been able to distinguish the various skills of each brother? Was one more business-oriented, the other more artistic? Was one more brick-oriented, and the other more
I can make that.
Yeah, well, no, I think that certainly from the drawings, George was more of a designer. He died much sooner, and am I right that George
One in 28.
Yeah. No, then Edward died early, and
No,
one.
one's 28 and one's 46.
Right. Okay. But one of them was blind, practically. And
George, I think.
yeah, and we also know now from research that Jay Shockley did that he just helped to designate at the Landmarks Commission, or I'm not sure it's designated, but one of their great Deco buildings on 22nd Street, 235 East 22nd. And in his research there, it seemed like Walter Katz was very involved, another architect, with their firm for a very long time, and probably was involved in design after George had died, and I believe Edward was going blind.
And that may have something to do with that fact that the Art Deco buildings are somewhat different from everything else
Yeah,
they've done.
they had-
Sometimes when Katz worked with them in the 20s, they always cite him when one of their buildings is in the building permits, or when one of their buildings is published. It always says George and Edward Blum and S. Walter Katz architects.
That's a new wrinkle that we haven't
We don't
explored.
really know if one was more the businessman, like, you know, like Mead and McKim, Mead and White, and then you could actually tell the aesthetic difference between McKim and White. But I don't. We certainly don't have any evidence of that.
Yes.
Who built the buildings? Who were the construction, the contractors, and did they have to get a special subset of contractors to do the decorative work?
You wouldn't need a subset of contractors for the decorative work because you would be going to, for the Terra-Cotta, one of the companies, I think for the metal work, which there's a lot of around the doorways, you would go to somebody who's in that business. And so I wouldn't think of them as really subcontractors. They were either artisans or specialists within a specific field. The tiles that they got were of top-notch quality. They were often by Henry Chapman Mercer from Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which is one of the great arts and crafts companies, or from Gruby Faience from Boston, which is another really important company that did a lot of subway ceramics. So they were looking for the relative cutting edge artisans of the time. In terms of contractors, I'm not really sure.
Contractors, I mean, we didn't see anything special about their contractors. There was nothing novel about building these buildings. They were,
although the masonry work,
buildings everywhere.
The masonry work took skill, but it meant somebody had to be skilled, and at that point in time, we were lucky enough to have skilled installers. It's a little different today.
So before we adjourn for wine, I just want to mention one thing. I showed you the East 17th Street building with the polychrome cast stone, and I just have to recommend that you go see the Adlon apartment house, which Michael has just restored the color to the cast concrete.
I didn't
on the scaffolding, we're painting restoring the color to the cast concrete. The Adlon's on 7th Avenue and 55th Street. 54th Street, on the southwest corner.
And when you go, look in
it.
the lobby, because there's been wonderful both restoration and new design that Michael has helped put into the lobby. The light fixtures, the door, right, the metal door work, and even on the, I guess it's the trash exit that's just got metal gates. There's some really nice Blum metal work that you'd recognize. It was restored?
Mike's the person who salvaged the doors.
Yes, he saved the doors from the Dahlia. We've got a real Blum couple here. Maybe I'll pass my Blum Mania shirt on to you. You're too small for it, though. So thank you.
Thank you.